Thank you all very much for coming back and not escaping. I understand that it is possible to submit questions via Slido if you want to. Sorry, but also if you'd prefer to just put your hand up and ask a question of any of the panelists, we have some roving microphones. So if anyone wants to, you can kick us off. If not, I'll start a couple of more malevolent questions of my own. I'm Alex Danoon. I do regulatory, and so we're going to be focusing on regulatory for the next hour or so. No, we won't. Oh, okay. How far are we from using digital twins in clinical trials to the point where we don't need to torture real-life individuals to take the relevant medicines, not drugs, with the associated risks involved? So, Roger, off to you. How long before we don't have to torture people in clinical trials?
It's a very complex picture. I mean, the hearts are probably the most developed of all. And I suppose a simple way to say how successful they are is you saw Yasmin's digital twin heart. That's based on a model called Alia Red, developed in Barcelona. And there are spin-out companies like LM. There are big companies like Dassault that are doing digital twins now. There are regulators like the FDA that are approving the use of digital twins data in trials. So, for example, if you've got a new drug and you're worried about heart arrhythmias, you can begin to test them on digital twins. If you've got some kind of device like these Medtronic pacemakers, they look like little paracetamol pills. They go in the wall of the heart. But obviously there are different, hearts come in different shapes and sizes, and there are little variations in architecture. And it could be, depending on where you put that little device, that it might not trigger a beat the way that you intended. So you can actually create virtual cohorts of hearts of different, shapes and sizes across a broad spectrum of possibility, just to check that that you don't disrupt this electromechanical pump. So it really depends on but if you think about the ultimate goal, which is you want to figure out your lifestyle, or your doctor wants to figure out why, you've got a constellation of strange symptoms, so you've got a whole body digital twin model. I think that's many decades away, but in terms of specific organ systems, it's beginning to go into use right now.
I'll jump in with my particular perspective on it. I think we're years away from replacing individuals. However, I've already seen a number of very sophisticated clinical trials being conducted with much smaller patient groups as a result of digital twinning and also predictive dose responses. And the regulators in this space, both the FDA over there and individual member state regulators here, are actually quite amenable to the idea of having much smaller clinical trial cohorts, because they're largely personalised. It's just how that individual responded. It is very hard to generalise across. So my particular perspective is we are probably at least a decade away before that will happen. But as an adjunct to make trials faster, more accurate, and torture less people, that would be a good thing.
That's a good response. That's better than my answer, actually, I think.
I think it's had torture in it. I don't suppose either of you want to jump in on clinical trials and digital twins?
I don't think I could do that one.
There is an interesting paper to read in the data protection world on the use of synthetic health data.
Yes, I suppose that's the segue, isn't it? Is to the extent, I think that we're going to see a lot more of people trying to, again, sort of get themselves into a much safer place in data protection law through the use of synthetic data, and that's really encouraged. However, there are lots of pitfalls there where you can accidentally end up with your synthetic data also being personal data if it is accidentally too reflective of the personal data on which it was trained. So you'd usually use a model to create the synthetic data, and sometimes that model can sort of accidentally reflect the data set on which it was trained. We also had some slightly bonkers and alarming suggestion more recently that it might even just be personal data if it accidentally looked like someone else. I think that is absolute nonsense, but clearly there are, there is this suggestion out there, and that in of itself therefore becomes a thing and becomes something that people are nervous about. I think that on the whole, from a data protection point of view, synthetic data can only be something that makes your life easier.
I was going to, Sarian, I was particularly excited about the the equity commentary you had. Are there other organisations you're working with to try and expand that as well? Are there other charities or other organisations that are looking in that particular space?
So we obviously did a fairly large consultation, so there are organisations out there. I mean, Wellcome itself is looking at this issue. I think it's an issue that actually everybody kind of is starting to grapple with. We may have got slightly ahead of the curve on it, in as much as I'm not aware of anywhere else that's produced any guidance yet for their own researchers. But I think it is definitely, there are quite a few organisations in the UK, and also the government has various departments who are also looking at this, and so there's quite a bit of preliminary guidance, I would say, broadly around some of these issues, but then of course they do start getting into the regulatory space around,
Before we abandon data and the Digital Information Bill, there's a question for you. Oh, you can see them, sorry.
Yeah. That one.
Hannah, I think that one's for you. For what it's worth, I'm pretty sure Konstantinos is from Our Future Health, the NHS entity.
I would disagree with that. I don't think, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill is a tweak around the edges to GDPR. It is not doing anything very radical. Now, one of the things it's trying to do is reduce red tape, classic example, and one of the things it's doing, therefore, is slightly changing things like the data protection impact assessment process. And so you could argue that that is a slight reduction. Overall, I actually don't think it does. I think in some ways one of the reasons why I think the bill is such a waste of time is that I don't think it does very much at all, except for the kind of two changes that I mentioned, which even in themselves, they're relatively small. They're still tweaking around the edges. So my position on this would be I don't think it does move the needle particularly, because ultimately I think it is largely a big fuss over nothing, so that, the government gets to be very excited and claim that we're now, getting the excitement of Brexit because we get to change and make our own laws. And in fact, I think what they've realised is that the existing law is pretty good, and we need that level of strong protection. So I think you could probably make the argument, but I don't think it's obvious, certainly, that it will reduce the protection.
No one else wants to jump in on data protection. I met the rapporteur of the data protection regulation, and I didn't enjoy it. I'm going to throw the third question across, but expand it a little. Does the man called Jan Albrecht, but I know the guy who's not going to give him his PhD, so that's good. The future of personalised medicine, does it lie more in the wet biology, the very high-end CRISPR T-cell therapies, or over in the high-resolution diagnostics, or is it more about developing new tools to develop better medicines? So is it a tool, is it a therapy, is it a diagnostic, or possibly is it a wellness and lifestyle deployment? Who wants to volunteer where they think, over we go, Sarah? Where do you think it's going to be?
I would say yes to all of those things. So I think I think it's more of a longitudinal question at this point. I think we are looking at all of those things. We're already seeing the wellness and lifestyle thing coming in with mixed results, should we say. I think genomics in particular is leading. We're very rapidly getting into that very high precision diagnosis. We see it particularly with cancer. We're also seeing it with rare diseases. We're going to start seeing it with other diseases very quickly, I think, as well. Pharmacogenomics is also beginning to kind of really come into its own, and so again we're going to start seeing that being used to make sure that people are given the right medicines. The costs of negative of using the wrong drugs, so negative consequences of those drugs is enormous for the NHS. So pharmacogenomics, I think, is a priority in that area, and yeah, I think we'll be seeing all of these things happening. CRISPR, obviously, we've just had a story this week about CRISPR being used. Obviously, somatic editing, not hereditary editing. But again, I think we will start to see those therapies coming in, but a bit more slowly, is my feeling. So.
Well, also interestingly, given that it's supposed to treat thalassemia and sickle cell anemia, and it's going to cost £1.5 million a pop, I'm not entirely convinced it's going to be widely deployed across Africa.
Yeah, the health economics are going to be interesting on that one.
Yeah.
It might make sense in the UK where we're spending a lot of money on treating these individuals, but yes, across Africa where they're not getting treatment.
Roger, you look like you had an opinion.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a complicated question because people mean different things by the term personalised medicine, and clearly, if you're taking T cells out the body and then you're turbocharging them, putting them back in to fight cancer, that's very personalised medicine. Equally, when I think about genomics, I covered the genome race in the 90s, and people talked endlessly about personalised medicine. Then they found that going from genotype to phenotype was much harder than they anticipated, and then personalised medicine became precision medicine, which is the same as stratified medicine, but precision medicine isn't as precise as personalised medicine anyway. It's all a bit confusing, really. But then the other side of the equation is you talked about more diagnostic data. I mean, I think that the true predictive and personalised medicine is more to do with digital twins than just diagnostic data. But those twins will only work if we have very high resolution data. And in fact, a true twin will have a constant dialogue between you and your twin, just as the best forecasting models have an endless dialogue between these massive computer models and real-time data coming from satellites and buoys and so on. So that's my long-winded answer.
Do you want to jump in on that one, Hannah? I'm going to jump in on Rosemary's question. Can we create a simple process to get therapies without commercial value from research phase into the clinic without exposing researchers to criminal penalties, such as things like identifying a particular predisposition to glioma without biopsy? No. And in fact, the direction of travel with the MHRA at the moment for accelerating things through the regulatory pathway is about making sure that they'll be usable in the NHS and paid for and actually widely deployed, rather than trying to give academics an easy ride. There is no appetite for that. I see no appetite for that at the moment. I haven't seen any appetite for that for 15 years or so. It seems to have gone off the radar, is my reg perspective on the reg question. No one wants to go. Today there's an online campaign aimed at scaring people into opting out of the NHS data gathering, because this will be processed by Palantir, dun, 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 and could be sold to Big Pharma. How should the life sciences community address this scare campaign about, if I'm add a little bit to it, it's the secondary processing for research purposes that is the issue, I think, here. And I'm guessing that might be you, at least first instance, Hannah.
Yes, you have to forgive me for being slightly outspoken about this, because I have found the reporting of this, I think, has been really, really frustrating, because there's clearly I think there's lots of different issues which are being quite muddled together in the reporting of the Palantir issue. Palantir is just providing software tools to the NHS. So in data protection parlance, they're a data processor. Now, you can clearly have a whole conversation about whether we should give them £350 million or however much it is from the NHS. That is a different conversation in terms of whether they are a worthy recipient of that. But I think in terms of, there's been this confusion between the idea that, oh, can I opt out of my data going into these software tools? But in fact, the National Data Opt-out, as probably everyone here knows, is about your data being used for further research purposes and has really very little to do with this idea of the software tools. And in all honesty, the idea that you can just opt out of your data being used by, being stored in a particular platform by the NHS. I mean, at some point, you just can't give people a choice to say, oh, I only want my information to be kept in hard copy in a filing cabinet so that, the receptionist can get access to it. Like, that's not the real world. The NHS, whilst it might be great if we had really, really good technology, unfortunately, I would say I think the idea that we have really good technology in the UK at the moment, unfortunately the US is leading the way there, and I think we'd be cutting off our noses to spite our faces slightly if everyone went, oh, we're not going to do any of this, we're just going to keep it all on a very sort of on-premises old-fashioned solution. And so the reporting, this idea that you should have a right to opt out, has just been very frustrating. So I think the question asked if there was anything the sector could do about that, and I just think trying to get out there and correct this misinformation, this misreporting, would be really helpful.
I'm guessing, Sarian, you've looked at some data trustability issues over the years.
Yeah, I think particularly, I won't necessarily comment on Palantir, but this issue of being sold to Big Pharma, the public is not stupid. They're actually quite nuanced in their views on this. And so, yes, generally, if you just say, are you concerned about your data being sold to Big Pharma, they will say yes. And I think there is some justification for that. But their concerns generally boil down to, what is the benefit to the taxpayer? What is the return of benefit? How is the NHS, particularly concerned about the NHS? And that is how we counteract some of this. We have to explain properly what the benefit is, and we need to ensure that the NHS is actually benefiting from all of these deals, which I think we've got much better at in the last few years. So that would be my answer to that. I'm not going to comment on Palantir.
Not going there, Roger?
No, I completely agree. I think if you talk in abstract terms about patient data, it always worries people. But if you can actually talk about, yes, there's always a risk of a data breach, but look at the benefits for society, look at the benefits for you, then I think you frame the conversation in a much more sensible way. People are very pragmatic, as you say.
I think are hugely pragmatic, and I think that the public actually has got quite a nuanced understanding of data sharing, and we should be listening to some of those concerns, because I think they want their health record, they want to be able to turn up at any hospital in the country and know that their health record can be accessed. So, they want that. But on the other hand, they might be asking, why are you sharing my data with this other person? And we have to be able to justify it and explain it. So, yeah.
Slightly daunted by the number of digital twin questions, but obviously you've been spectacularly successful. Anyone who hasn't bought Roger's book yet, you should be buying Roger's book. Clearly there's some questions here. I'll go all the way for sentience. Why not? When are you going to build a digital twin of my brain that's so good that it would be sentient and therefore illegal for you to conduct clinical trials on my digital brain?
It is obviously the ultimate challenge, and I was trying to show there is a virtual brain project in Europe, but I think we go into this in the book, but one of the interesting problems is that does the brain work like a digital computer? And the answer is no. B, can you recapitulate all the nuances of reality on a digital machine? I think the answer is also no. It's actually kind of a shocking, I don't know how much of this stuff you want to hear, but Peter, my co-author, looked at chaotic systems, chaos, the butterfly effect. It was discovered when Ed Lorenz in the 60s thought he was running the same kind of primitive weather simulations on a computer and found that the answers were completely different. And when he looked into it, he found that he'd rounded the numbers and got completely different results after a while, and that's the famous butterfly effect. Of course, digital machines, they run on floating point numbers, so these are truncated numbers. So if you're worried about nonlinear systems, you have to worry about the fact that digital machines use limited strings of binary. And when Peter looked at a toy chaotic system called the Bernoulli map, which you can mathematically solve exactly, which is very difficult to do in lots of other chaotic systems, and compared the examples, what a digital computer was saying, the computer was wrong. It was actually wrong. So I think you have to be a little bit, there's a problem of A, does the brain work like a computer? Probably not. B, can you recapitulate analog reality on a digital machine? Maybe not. There are ways around it with ensembles and things like that. And then there are people like Roger Penrose, who would argue from first principles that you cannot, you can't recapitulate a brain on a computer. So it's a giant question that you've asked, but I think it's going to be many years. I think we will be able to simulate processes in the brain to some degree, but things like consciousness, which we can't even define yet, as I said at the start, or intelligence, which when I say we can't define, there is no agreed definition of consciousness and intelligence. I think it's very difficult to see how progress being made for some decades.
Even if we achieve consciousness, they're not getting data protection rights. The GDPR is very clear on that one. A natural person, so we're all, at least I'm sorted.
A living natural person?
Yes, living natural person, exactly. No dead people, no robots.
Looks like there's two questions there for you, Sarian. Can you tell us more about access, Southeast Asia, etc., and also what are the impediments? I know you talked about the impediments a little bit, but...
So I guess directly, this is quite a difficult challenge to increase the number of data access agreements because, of course, we're not in control of who applies to our data. I will say we work quite hard with applicants to try and get them through the data access process. So it isn't a case of, oh, you've messed the form up, you're done. And we do make quite an effort, particularly with applicants who may not just from low and middle income countries, but who generally may not have that much experience with applying for data sets, to support them with that. I guess on a longer term view, the Representative Research Project is aiming to increase the diversity, increase the representation of our data, so that should make it more relevant, but we're looking at a 10, 15 year probably run up really to having much more interesting data. I think though the thing that is really important is actually more around capacity building and helping those countries that haven't got strong genomic technologies to improve it and do this work for themselves. I mean, Sanger shouldn't be doing all of the work on behalf of the world. It's not the right way of doing it. And so actually, I would say rather than trying to increase the number of data access applications, which I hope we will see an increase in those applications, but rather than focusing on that, we're focusing on our capacity building, we're focusing on making sure that the partnerships that we have with countries is leaving behind improved and increased capacity. We're supporting our partners. We're also trying to engage with countries that we've maybe never engaged with before. And this isn't just on human data as well. So we've got quite a lot of work around sequencing for epidemics and pandemics, and looking at tropical disease, as those are obviously areas where I think we can make quite big inroads. And so I would say we're probably not directly trying to support, going to address that question, but instead it's going to be a sort of slightly more indirect improvement on that map. I think there was a question about Russia and Africa and why we don't see that many applications. Russia I can't comment on, to be honest. We've never had, as far as I'm aware, we've never had an application from Russia. We certainly would consider an application from Russia just like we would any other application. I'm assuming the question was hinting at political difficulties there, and that isn't something that we look at particularly. Again, across Africa, I think it comes back to, often people seem to believe that we wouldn't give them the data if they applied, so they rule themselves out before they even start, and they don't have the download capacities. These are big data sets, and they take a lot of compute to use, and a lot of places just don't have that facility. Yeah.
I have a fix for you all in relation to the imperfect nature of data, and that is, of course, a regulation. the European Commission's draft AI regulation, the AI Act, will require that in order for you to get a permit effectively for your AI system, and all medical devices that use AI will require one of these permits, your data set needs to be perfect and representative of everyone. So the AI Act will fix it, absolutely no problem. Perfection is baked into the statute. All you need is that.
And the AI Act is, at the moment, looks like the exact opposite, by the way, of the principles-based law that I was advocating for earlier. So.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the AI Act either, if I'm honest, but nonetheless, we'll move on. My feeling there are lots of small steps, but they're going to take a long time. And I would expect regulators to start demanding, as part of the approval process for a device, a diagnostic or a medicine, follow-up studies in rarer communities, or in pregnant women, you know.
Yep.
So I think that's probably where, from my perspective, my cognitive bias, that's where I think things will start to come. Oof, who wants to jump in on insurance companies having access to UK Biobank data environments?
Shall I launch myself into the belly of the beast? So, I mean, I've said that I am a big fan of GDPR, and I do honestly believe that it does create quite a lot of guardrails. I mean, taking it back to kind of, I suppose, a slightly more... my dream world is that the UK is in a position anyway where we have a national health service, and so medical insurance as an industry is perhaps less of a concern for all of us anyway, but that's a slightly different point. But I do think that the GDPR is regulating those organisations. So I would say that, like, I think there's a sort of, oh, goodness me, should they be allowed to? I think you could look back at the GDPR and say, well, the GDPR regulates them just as much as it regulates anyone. And so they need to, you need to look at that specific situation and say, well, their processing still has to be fair. It has to be transparent. They have to have a lawful basis. And so I would, the optimistic side of me would say that the GDPR will, in the same way that I think a lot of people feel like, oh, it causes so many problems for us to do this really exciting thing, I think it also does provide an awful lot of protection. It gives people individual rights. You can go to those companies and ask for and delete your data, but also even more proactively, because it's actually, the GDPR is quite sort of paternalistic as a law. And so it will regulate them the same way it regulates you, and I think puts a lot of limits over what they can actually do with that data.
My understanding is that the moratorium is still in place, the one that they renew every 5 years or so, and so far the insurers haven't crossed the Rubicon.
Yeah. I was at the meeting where the moratorium was agreed to be extended, and this was we must be coming up to the next 5 years, I guess, but at the time there was actually surprisingly little interest from the insurance companies around this data, mostly because actuarial data really gives them everything. So the one exception, of course, is around Huntington's disease, and I believe it's £300,000 limit for life insurance. So, I mean, I have to say Sanger doesn't allow insurance companies to access the data, but I'm not sure I know what the companies are actually going to do with it that's different from what they're already doing, if I'm honest. So, yeah.
Well, back to digital twins. Which one do you want?
Gosh, let's have a look.
What if it goes wrong?
Complex cell interactions, yes. Will we be able to use digital twins simulate complex cell interactions? I mean, in the book we go through lots of different examples. I mean, there are virtual cells. So Marcus Covert in Stanford has made, Mycoplasma genitalium, and you can knock out genes and you get pretty good correspondence with what happens to the real organism. Peter's worked with IBM and others on looking at what happens when a cell becomes infected with a virus, and then viral peptides get presented on the surface of the cell to trigger T-cell attack, and they can model that, with reasonable veracity. There are virtual tumors and things like that. So people are chipping away at lots of different problems all over the place, really. And then regulatory challenges. Of course, one of the things is, can we believe this stuff? probably the central problem with AI. You know, it looks plausible, but is it right? So there is a big effort in what's called VVUQ, validation, verification, uncertainty qualification, to convince the regulators that what the digital twin is telling us is dependable, you know, within reason.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything that looks like an immediate diagnostic in the short term. Can I go to the third question? Back to you, Roger, but also because there's a reg in the question. That's a good way to get a question asked. How are the expected regulatory challenges given, particularly where digital twin might actually effectively have treatment control, might direct or dictate the treatment of a particular patient, or even digital shadows, so a support system to whisper in the ear of the surgeon or in the ear of the oncologist? How do you feel the regulators are going to cope with such ideas?
Well, you know, I've mentioned one aspect, which is just believing the results of the twin is absolutely, you know, critical. You know, I think the fact that we've got the FDA now using twin data,
Yep.
You know, means that there are ways around this. But I don't, you know, I think this would be, I'd hope that doctors will embrace this. I mean, clearly at the moment, a lot of the leading, you know, one of the issues is that, you know, we're using very big machines with bespoke software to run these simulations, and they're just not something that your average GP could tap into. But the hope is that in the longer term, you know, they will lead to simplified models that might actually be, you know, at the moment, if you're presented with an elderly patient, doctors do this sort of weird thing where when you say, what's wrong with Uncle Fred, they say, well, you know, he's got high blood pressure and low sodium, and they give you a list of symptoms, and the answer is they don't actually know what's wrong with Uncle Fred. And you'd hope that with simplified models, you know, whole body metabolic models, we might be able to get insight into things like complex, they might be on 15 different pills which might be interacting in complex ways, or they might be on the way to diabetes or whatever. And the twin might actually give a bit more of an insight into what this complex constellation of you know, symptoms telling them. I've slightly evaded the regulatory thing because I must admit I'm much more interested in the science end of it than the regulatory end of it. Forgive me, all you regulators out there.
There is an idiosyncrasy here that these types of products that do suggest something to the doctor and inform clinical management will be regulated as medical devices. The FDA has an exemption for clinical decision support tools, where it is merely whispering in the ear of the doctor, and provided that the doctor can understand what is being whispered in her ear, then there's an exemption for these in America. We do not have such an exemption here. I do not see much enthusiasm for a lowering of the requirements in relation to these products in the short, medium, or, if I'm honest, long term. Would be my reg perspective, but I'm often wrong. Well, entirely different direction. Wearables. Which direction do we see wearables moving, and the extent to which they are likely to be embedded in healthcare, lead to much more personalised medicine, whether it be a Fitbit or a continuous glucose monitor or an insulin pump? Which direction do we see? I assume we're all going to say we're anticipating a lot more of it rather than a lot less of it. Anyone want to express any reservations about wearables?
I mean, I think it's inevitable. I mean, we're already getting a lot of data,
yes,
you know, from our smartphones. And actually, there's a lot of interest in using so-called digital phenotypes, you know, where, you know, when you look at mental health at the moment, you know, we basically wait for someone to have an enormous crisis before they get any treatment. You know, the hope is that if you could gather data, you know, on their activity patterns or whatever, and there are other more sophisticated, you know, there's glasses you can wear now that, you know, look at, you know, your gaze and pupil dilation and mood and so on. You know, the hope is that with things like digital phenotypes, you might actually have a bit of advance warning of someone approaching crisis. You can actually head it off rather than wait for the crisis, which is the way that healthcare works at the moment. And actually, if digital twins really take off, then they'll rely on, you know, much more. You think about the amount of data that your doctor gathers on you. I mean, it's completely pitiful, isn't it? You know, it's the odd blood pressure measurement now and again, you know, not even, well, rarely during a 24-hour period and so on. So I think there's going to be a huge expansion on the use of wearables providing much richer data for AI and all sorts of things, and digital twins as well. As for the regulatory side, I'll leave it to all you clever regulators out there.
One really interesting thing about wearables, it's somewhere where we've done quite a lot of work in this area, and it's a real, one of the real shifts of it is that it's very rarely your healthcare provider who is providing the wearable, and so there's usually an app or something like that that goes along with it, and it requires you at that point to then have a direct relationship with the provider of the med tech, of the wearable. And so it introduces a third party in a way that we haven't really seen otherwise. And they have a relationship with the healthcare provider, so with your doctor, but it's slightly different. You have to agree that your data goes to this third party. They will probably want to use that data to further their own research, to further that product improvement. And so it really is a bit of a game changer. That would usually be a private company who you're interacting with because your doctor has suggested you do that. And so from a data protection perspective, that actually really has become a game changer. It's that world where you're saying, okay, well, what is their lawful basis at that point? And that one definitely needs quite a lot of careful thought, and is something that we haven't really seen until this sort of explosion in medtech that you use directly, so sort of consumer-facing medical technology.
Just that I think the obvious answer is yes, it's going to increase massively. I mean, I recently participated in Zoe, which I'm sure several of you have done. I mostly did it because I've actually, despite talking a lot about big data, I've actually never participated in a kind of big data type exercise, so I thought I would have a go at it. And it has been quite an interesting experience. I would also say wearing a blood glucose monitor and then getting COVID was I spent a lot of time sitting on my sofa looking at my glucose. But it is quite addictive as well. I think people are very hooked on this information, and you do start getting sucked into it. And I was kind of like, well, can I get another glucose monitor? So I think we are going to see a huge amount. And also, but going back to your point, I mean, Zoe is using that data in all sorts of ways, and that's one of the reasons why I participated, was sort of to see how it feels, knowing that and seeing the outcomes of it. But I think we're going to see a huge expansion in that kind of thing.
In parallel with the point that Hannah made about the data protection issues, I'll give you an example to try and make my point. Whenever I run triathlons, I get these special shoes that monitor my gait, and you have some stupid little chip in it. I don't even know what it does, but it measures my gait, and it helps me get ready for my triathlons much better. I swear, but obviously I don't. Now, when that chip is sold to me by whichever footwear company sold me the shoes with the, actually my son hasn't, but they didn't want that to be used as a medical device. That shoe could be used to predict, if I made my father wear it, Parkinson's. And gait measurement, deterioration or changes in gait measurement, are actually much better than almost any other measure of Parkinson's. The shoe guy doesn't want this to be a Parkinson's medical device, and certainly doesn't want to go through the approval, and doesn't want to sell this super cool, ultra expensive triathlon shoe as a Parkinson's monitor, and so that the grandparents realise what I'm up to when I put the cool shoes on. Anyway, but it's the intermediary. It's the person in the middle who builds the app to pick up the data from the shoe and then make a prediction about it. And they will be the person who's regulated in my world, and they're the person who causes havoc in your world, simply because it doesn't fit neatly. So I think a lot of what will happen in wearables will be people thinking of secondary, tertiary, quaternary uses, other uses for things that are already there that are gathering really rich data, and then saying, here, I found something interesting about it, or I can cure whatever. And those people will probably be, a lot of those people will be quite small, quite nimble, and perhaps not fully compliant with the law, simply because they think they're doing a public good. They might even be doing it, Rosemary, without economic benefit, and thereby be exempted from law, which isn't my favourite derogation. Anyway, so I think wearables is going crazy.
If you're a 10-person startup, it's also really hard to comply. It's just a lot of paperwork and a lot of time, isn't it?
Yep.
Like, I mean,
And crimes. Are we going to see more regulatory sandboxes? Yes. And we're going to see more efforts by the regulator. One big issue I want to mention very briefly is post-Brexit, the MHRA has been told to stop being a watchdog regulator and to be a facilitative regulator. In effect, if you get an approval for your medicine, medical device, or in vitro diagnostic in the rest of the world, Europe, America, Japan, anywhere, it'll get rubber stamped into the UK. And you are supposed instead to go to the MHRA with your innovative cool things in order for the MHRA to approve them years earlier than would be approved elsewhere. So in breaking free of the rest of the world, the MHRA has been instructed to do things radically differently. We haven't seen what that actually looks like in terms of statutes. It's just been press releases so far. But there is a very interesting thing happening, that the UK wants to position itself as the proving ground for a lot of this stuff and not the dumping ground. And they did cover themselves in glory in the pandemic. So I think the MHRA is well positioned. Do I think it'll be sandboxes? I never know what sandboxes really mean. But yes, they come littered in every press release that I see from the regulators. Pangenome. How do we get the scientific community to use more diverse genomic sequences instead of less diverse reference genomes? Will it happen organically, or do you need to beat them into submission?
So I think it will happen organically. I'd like to think that I was talking about diversity in data before it was cool, but it is a really big issue facing the scientific community, and I think a lot of people are very interested in this topic right now and want to address it. Plus, of course, when we say diversity in this context, there is a danger of slightly othering people. Diversity is maybe not diversity to other places in the world. So if we are producing data that covers various populations, it will probably be of interest to that population. I do think that there is a need to improve statistical methodologies and develop new statistical methodologies that allow us to look at diversity, because diversity and scale are not entirely compatible with each other. The more diverse your data set, the smaller the individual categories within it are, and therefore the fewer the findings that you're going to get. A massive, very homogeneous data set will allow you to get a lot of findings out of it, but of course those may not benefit everybody equally. So I'm going to say yes, organically, but we could have a few tweaks would help.
Anyone else want to delve into the pangenome?
absolutely not.
There's a question about AI intellectual property. You genuinely, in the audience, have some of the UK's leading intellectual property lawyers, and they'd be thrilled to talk to you in drinks. They'd just love it, unless any of them wants to volunteer and jump up and explain how AI and intellectual property is going to work. Or do you need alcohol in order to cope? Looks like we're leaving that with alcohol. Okay, I was going to ask a broader... Sorry, I thought someone was about to volunteer. I was going to ask a broader question along the lines of, and it's a very intentionally broad question, what are the main impediments to clinical deployment of personalised medicine, whatever that means? So, I mean, it's just your particular cognitive bias, I guess, but is it funding? Are these things just too expensive? Is it concerns regarding misuse of personal data or genetic data? Is it incomplete or unrepresentative data sets? Is it clinical inertia? Doctors do what they want. You can give them as much information as they want, but they'll treat you however they feel like it. fairly serious problem for those of you working on polygenic risk scores, but we'll move on from that. Patient concerns and or unwillingness to participate or share their data. Overly complicated and or demanding regulations. Is there a single problem? Is it a bit of everything? Does anyone have a particular silver bullet they'd like in order to have the widespread deployment of personalised medicine? Assuming we think personalised medicine is a good thing.
I mean, actually, just interestingly, in terms of roadblocks, say, for digital twins, I think that there's actually two things that I think are getting in the way. One is that actually, obviously, you know, to do the coolest simulations, you need the biggest computers on the planet. I mentioned we're in the exascale era, which is 10 to the 18, what a floating point operations a second. Peter works on Frontier, which is the first official exascale machine. I think China, interestingly, has got some unofficial exascale machines. Those machines are really hitting the limits of what we can do with conventional digital computing. You know, if you look at Aurora, which is another machine in the States, to keep it cool, they've got pipes, 3-foot wide cooling pipes of water pumping through it. It's a 60 megawatt machine, 60 megawatts, you know, it's like a town. So if you think about going beyond exascale, we'll need some radically new computational methods. Analog, running on light, because it's much lower energy consumption, much greener. That's another problem with AI, and also quantum computing as well. But there's also a cultural issue, which is that most biologists just love data. And they love AI because they think if I just get a massive data set and I just point an AI at it, I get a paper and I'm really happy. They're kind of skeptical about mechanistic modeling. Yeah. They kind of think it's a sad engineer's approach. So I think there's a huge cultural problem among biologists and medics to get them to accept that mathematical modeling is actually really useful. Because if your model doesn't work, it means you don't understand the physics. And if it does work, you can look into the future and predict stuff. And how cool is that?
So culture and infrastructure from you. Yeah. Either of you, any impediments?
I think you can guess what I'm going to say, but I would say I think all of the things you said, but most of those are almost secondary issues. The primary issue for me is data gaps. You can't do personalised medicine without the data on the people that you're trying to treat. And so I think once you have the data, you can start to think about personalised medicine, and then all of those other issues start to come into play. So it's quite a challenging problem.
I'm thoroughly convinced by the answers of the two people on my panel, because sort of my contribution to this is that I think it is not, I guess, data protection law, but that it is a very often a really useful scapegoat, right? People are sort of scared and nervous and they throw their hands up and blame the law. But I think that you've given some more practical challenges, which actually are probably more realistic.
So funding's not a particular concern? I mean, well...
I don't know. Yeah. Always, yeah. No, I don't think so. I think it's probably a basic health economics argument. If you can prove that it's cost effective, then it was more likely to happen. So.
One of the few good things about GDPR is it made normal regulation look gentle and kind. So none of you said that the regulatory framework's overly burdensome, because it's not. It's wonderful in every regard. No, I mean, there are serious difficulties with trying to push the boundaries with a lot of this. And we do need to inform the community, we need to inform the clinicians, we need to inform the researchers, and sadly we need to inform the regulators. They are playing catch up. Most of them are relatively well-intentioned, but my goodness, they're playing catch-up. Not a lot of people went to science school in order to go and become a regulator. So I'm afraid, sadly, it's not necessarily the cream of the crop that are over there. He says, jeopardising his entire career. Would you agree that most of the public would rather suffer as a result of a mistake made by a hungover doctor or radiologist rather than by a machine? And how do we overcome the skepticism regarding the reliance on digital models to overcome the fact that people feel more reassured by the hungover, depressed radiologist? Education, I think.
Yeah, education, I think, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, people will become more used to this idea, right? Like it is, you know, I think there's also just going to be an inevitable passage of time when we all just get used to the idea that we're much more comfortable interacting with machines. We will start trusting them more. They will get more trustworthy, in all honesty, because they'll just get better. The sort of, you know, the...
Yeah. I think we already see it. We have autopilot in planes. We have, you know, we have machines in surgery. I think, yes, people do have this sort of logical fallacy about this, but it doesn't always create a barrier to actually implementing it. So, yeah, I completely agree.
You heard my bias in the way I changed the question. One of the things that I think will really influence it is going to be people using wellness wearables, people just getting used to monitoring a lot about themselves, people wanting to feel empowered, people wanting to gather that information. And I think that will drive a lot of use. Now, a lot of what I've just said is very culturally specific. There's not a lot of there's a lot less continuous glucose monitors in sub-Saharan Africa than there are in Islington. I can assure you, everyone seems to. Anyway, no. But that would be the place that I see it coming. But again, I'm almost always wrong. We're going to repeat the poll at the beginning. Can I ask, instead of that question about fear, what do you think in terms of a deployment of personalised medicine? If there was an enthusiastic deployment by, I don't know, the NHS or a private provider, what could go wrong that could lead to a backlash against, such that we do clamp down on personalised medicine or make it more regulated? Do any of you have a scenario that keeps you up at night, that makes you worry about what the digital twin's going to do to you or what the genomic data is going to miss?
I wouldn't say it keeps me up at night, but I think we already see a resistance to, you know, if you look at vaccine hesitancy and vaccine denial, there are some cultural elements to that, and so I don't see why it would necessarily be different for personalised medicine. And there is a real fear and scepticism amongst certain communities, and some of those communities do have good cause to have some scepticism of modern medicine. And so I do think, I don't know that it will cause a backlash, because often those are the communities that have the least impact and least effect on things. So not necessarily backlash, but they'll certainly be the ones that lose out and increase health inequities that we already see.
Because from my point of view, it would be the bias. So, and I think, you know, if you take kind of women is a more straightforward one, because we do have slightly more of a voice, right? But we're still often underrepresented, but we're not a minority. But I can see that happening. If people were just like, you know what, this just doesn't reflect me, then I think that could really sort of, you would then get groups of people just opting out of the whole thing.
Yeah.
I think also, you know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, using AI, and I think you have to be careful to think hard about the training set for the AI. You know, we know about, there's endless examples of biases in AI. And clearly, if you can train an AI on, you know, let's say, in fact, you gave a great example. We were gossiping earlier about, you know, you're growing stem cells or whatever.
Debating.
From an individual patient, you're challenging them with different cocktails of drugs, and an AI can figure out which combinations of drugs are killing a tumor or whatever. That's a personalized AI, but often AI is actually, you know, it's learning off, you know, diverse groups of people, and you're going back to a one-size-fits-all solution that won't necessarily work for everyone. So it'll get you some way down the road, but I would actually say, weirdly, AI is not going to give you personalized medicine if you're training it on, you know, information from a diverse group of people. And of course, it won't be truly diverse as we know.
Yeah.
It'll be biased because half the population, roughly speaking, will be missing because there won't be enough female data in the data set. You know, we won't have anyone, you know, from African descent and so on, or very few. So, yeah, that concerns me, I think.
well, on the note of that concern, could you throw up the poll again, in part because Hugo, who is manfully volunteered to write up the notes today, would also like to check where we got to. So please, if people could fill that in. I'm a little terrified as to where we're going to end up with the results of the poll, but otherwise it falls to me very much to thank the speakers. I genuinely found it an exciting debate. I think it's a really interesting set of perspectives on what is going to inevitably be hugely pervasive and change the way we're going to live. So if you could join me in thanking the speakers, that'd be much appreciated.